I never thought I'd be the kind of woman who'd lose everything overnight. But there I was, standing in an empty apartment that used to be filled with the life Marcus and I had built together over 12 years. The furniture? Gone. The savings account we'd been building since our honeymoon in Cancun? Drained. Even the car I'd driven to work every single day was nowhere to be found when I came home that Tuesday evening in late September. Let me back up and tell you how I got here, because this story doesn't start with the devastation. It starts with me being the fool who didn't see it coming. My name is Jennifer, and I met Marcus when I was 23 years old, fresh out of college with a degree in marketing and stars in my eyes about what life could be. He was 28, already established in his family's real estate business, confident in a way that made me feel safe. His father, Robert, had built the company from nothing, and Marcus was being groomed to take it over someday. I was working at a small advertising agency, barely making rent on a studio apartment I shared with my college roommate. Marcus swept me off my feet. He took me to restaurants I couldn't pronounce the names of, surprised me with weekend trips, and made me feel like I was the center of his universe. When he proposed after 2 years of dating, I said yes without hesitation. My parents loved him. My friends were jealous. Everything seemed perfect. We got married in a beautiful ceremony at a vineyard upstate. His family paid for most of it, which should have been my first clue about what was to come, but I was too in love to see the strings attached. Robert gave a toast that night that I remember word for word. He said, "Marcus, you found yourself a good woman. Jennifer, welcome to the family. We take care of our own, and now you're one of us." The first few years were good, really good. We bought a house, a beautiful 4-bedroom colonial, with a wraparound porch that I fell in love with the moment I saw it. Marcus insisted we put it only in his name because it would be better for tax purposes related to the business. I trusted him. Why wouldn't I? We were married. What was his was mine, right? I kept working at the agency, climbing my way up to senior account manager. Marcus worked long hours at the real estate firm, and I told myself that was just what ambitious people did. We talked about having kids someday, but he always said we should wait until the business was more stable, until we had more money saved, until the timing was right. Years went by. I turned 30, then 32, then 35. The conversation about children became less frequent until it stopped altogether. I threw myself into my work, won awards for campaigns I'd developed, and tried to ignore the growing distance between Marcus and me. We still went to family dinners at Robert's house every Sunday. We still took our annual vacation to the Caribbean. From the outside, we looked like the perfect couple. But something had shifted. Marcus came home later and later. He was always on his phone, always distracted. When I tried to talk to him about it, he'd get defensive, saying I didn't understand the pressure he was under, that the business was going through a difficult time, that I should be more supportive instead of nagging him. I started to feel crazy. Was I being paranoid? Was I asking for too much? I talked to my best friend Diana about it over coffee one Saturday morning. Diana said, "Jen, I'm going to be real with you. Something doesn't feel right. Trust your gut." But I didn't want to trust my gut. I wanted to trust my husband. So I pushed the doubts down and tried harder to be the perfect wife. I cooked his favorite meals, bought lingerie I felt ridiculous wearing, suggested couples therapy in the gentlest way possible. He shot down every attempt. Then came that Tuesday in September that changed everything. I'd had a particularly good day at work. We'd just landed a major account, and my boss had hinted at a promotion coming my way. I stopped at the grocery store on the way home, planning to make a special dinner to celebrate. Maybe tonight would be the night Marcus and I could reconnect, I thought. Maybe we could get back what we'd lost. I pulled into our driveway around 6:30 in the evening. Marcus's car wasn't there, which wasn't unusual. He often worked until 8 or 9. I balanced the grocery bags on my hip while I unlocked the front door. The silence hit me first. Our house was never completely quiet. We always had music playing, or the TV on in the background, or at least the hum of the refrigerator. But this was different. This was the silence of emptiness. I walked into the living room and froze. The couch was gone, the coffee table, the lamps, the TV we'd bought together just last Christmas. Everything. I dropped the grocery bags, and eggs cracked across the hardwood floor, but I barely noticed. I ran through the house, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might break through my chest. The dining room was empty. Our bedroom had nothing but the built-in closet, which hung open to reveal bare hangers where Marcus's clothes had been. The guest rooms were stripped. Even the garage was empty except for oil stains where our 2 cars used to park. I stood in the middle of what used to be our bedroom, trying to process what I was seeing. My phone rang, and I grabbed it desperately, hoping it was Marcus with some explanation that would make this make sense. It was an automated message from our bank. Our joint savings account had been closed. I logged into the banking app with shaking hands. The checking account we'd shared showed a balance of $47.18. The savings account that had held nearly $150,000 was listed as closed. I called Marcus. It went straight to voicemail. I called again and again, each time getting the same automated response. I texted him asking where he was, what was happening, and pleading for him to call me. Nothing. I called his office. The receptionist, Kelly, who I'd met at multiple company parties, answered in her usual cheerful voice. Kelly said, "Hi, Jennifer, what can I do for you?" I tried to keep my voice steady and told her I really needed to speak with Marcus. There was a pause. Then she said, "Oh, honey, he said if you called to tell you that he'd be in touch through his lawyer. I'm so sorry. I didn't realize you didn't know." The phone slipped from my hand and clattered onto the floor. His lawyer. He'd planned this. Every single bit of it. I don't know how long I sat there on the floor of our empty bedroom. It could have been 10 minutes or 2 hours. Eventually, I called Diana. She answered on the first ring asking what was up. I couldn't speak at first. My throat felt like someone had their hands wrapped around it. Diana's voice changed immediately. She asked what was wrong and told me to talk to her. The words came out in a rush. I told her he was gone. Everything was gone. The furniture, the money, his clothes, everything. The house was empty. He wouldn't answer his phone. His office said he'd be in touch through his lawyer. Diana said she was coming over right now and told me not to move. She'd be there in 15 minutes. She made it in 12. When I opened the door for her, she took one look at my face and pulled me into a hug. I broke down completely, sobbing into her shoulder like a child. Diana walked through the empty house with me, her face getting angrier with each room we entered. She made me sit down on the floor since there were no chairs, and she called her husband to bring over some basics like a blow-up mattress, folding chairs, paper plates, whatever he could grab quickly. We sat on that floor, and she held my hand while I tried to piece together what had happened. The signs had been there, hadn't they? The distance, the late nights, the defensiveness. But I'd never imagined this. Who does something like this to someone they promise to love forever? Over the next few days, the full extent of Marcus's betrayal became clear. The house was in his name only, just like he'd said, for tax purposes. The cars were registered to him. The savings account had been joint, but apparently either person could close it and take all the money. Our checking account had the minimum balance to keep it from being closed entirely. Probably just an oversight on his part. I hired a lawyer, a sharp woman named Patricia who came highly recommended. She looked over the documents I'd managed to gather and delivered the bad news with practiced sympathy. Patricia said she was going to be straight with me. This was going to be difficult. The house was never in my name. The cars were his. He could argue that the savings account was marital property that he was entitled to half of, and I'd have to prove that I contributed to it equally. She asked if I had records of my deposits. I shook my head. We'd always just pooled our money. I'd been paid through direct deposit, and I'd never thought to track exactly how much of that $150,000 was mine versus his. Patricia continued, saying the good news was that in this state, I was entitled to equitable distribution of marital assets. We could fight for my share of the house's value, the cars, and definitely the savings. But it was going to take time, and it was going to be expensive. She needed a retainer of $5,000 to start. I looked at my bank account. After paying my lawyer's retainer, I'd have barely enough to cover 2 months of rent in a cheap apartment. I'd have to use credit cards for everything else. I moved into a tiny studio apartment on the outskirts of town, the kind of place I hadn't lived in since college. It was humiliating. I was 37 years old, starting over with nothing but the clothes Marcus had left behind because they were in the laundry when he cleared out, and a blow-up mattress Diana had insisted I keep. Work became my refuge. I threw myself into projects, stayed late every night, and volunteered for every assignment that came up. My colleagues noticed something was off, but I deflected their concerns with vague comments about stress at home. I wasn't ready to tell them the truth. I wasn't ready to be that woman, the one everyone whispered about in the break room. The divorce proceedings started. Marcus hired an expensive attorney from a firm in the city, someone with a reputation for being ruthless. My lawyer, Patricia, did her best, but we were outmatched and outfinanced. Marcus claimed that I'd contributed nothing to our marriage financially, that the house had been purchased primarily with money from his family, that the cars were necessary for his business and therefore his property. Every court date felt like another knife in my back. I'd sit across from Marcus in those sterile conference rooms, and he wouldn't even look at me. The man who'd promised to love me forever couldn't even meet my eyes, while his lawyer argued that I deserved nothing from our 12 years together. The first hearing was in late October, just 6 weeks after he'd left. I remember walking into that courthouse feeling like I was going to throw up. Patricia met me in the hallway and she tried to prepare me for what was coming. She said Marcus's lawyer was going to paint a picture of me as a dependent spouse who hadn't contributed financially to the marriage. She warned me not to react, not to let them see me cry, not to give them anything they could use against me. But when I walked into that conference room and saw Marcus sitting there in his expensive suit, looking completely calm and collected, something inside me cracked. This was the man who used to hold me when I had nightmares, the man who'd promised to always protect me. And now he was trying to destroy me. His lawyer, a woman named Catherine with perfectly styled hair and a cold smile, started laying out their position. She said that Marcus had been the primary breadwinner throughout the marriage, that the house had been purchased with a substantial down payment from his family, that I had contributed minimal amounts to the household finances. Patricia interrupted, saying that I had worked throughout the entire marriage and contributed my entire salary to our joint accounts. That was marital property. Catherine smiled and said that according to their calculations, my contributions amounted to less than 30% of our total household income. She said Marcus had been generous in allowing me to live in a house he could have afforded on his own, to drive a car his family business had subsidized, to enjoy a lifestyle that was well beyond what my salary alone could have provided. I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell them that I'd sacrificed my own career advancement to support Marcus's business dinners, his networking events, his family obligations, that I'd turned down job offers that would have required relocating because he didn't want to leave his father's company, that I'd put my dreams on hold again and again because his career always came first. But I sat there silently, my hands clenched in my lap, while they tore apart every contribution I'd made to our marriage. The hearing lasted 3 hours. By the end of it, the judge had ordered temporary support payments that barely covered my rent and utilities. Everything else would be determined in the final settlement, which Patricia said could take months or even years to resolve. I walked out of that courthouse feeling more defeated than I'd ever felt in my life. Patricia tried to reassure me, saying this was just the first step, that we'd build a stronger case, that we'd fight for what I deserved. But all I could think about was how I was going to survive the next few months on the pittance the court had ordered Marcus to pay. Diana was furious on my behalf. She wanted to post about it on social media, to tell everyone we knew what Marcus had done, but I stopped her. I don't know why. Pride, maybe. Or maybe just the hope that if I stayed quiet, it would all resolve itself somehow. But staying quiet was killing me. I started having panic attacks at work. I'd be in the middle of a meeting, and suddenly I couldn't breathe. My chest would tighten, my vision would blur, and I'd have to excuse myself and hide in the bathroom until it passed. My boss, Linda, called me into her office one afternoon in November. She closed the door and gestured for me to sit down. Linda said she'd noticed I hadn't been myself lately. She asked if everything was okay, if there was anything going on that she should know about. I tried to hold it together. I really did. But when she asked the question with such genuine concern in her voice, everything I'd been holding in just poured out. I told her about Marcus, about the divorce, about living in a studio apartment and fighting just to get back a fraction of what I'd lost. She listened without interrupting, and when I finally finished, she handed me a box of tissues and said something I'll never forget. Linda said she'd been through a divorce herself 15 years ago. She said her ex-husband had tried to do something similar, and she understood exactly what I was going through. She told me to take the rest of the day off, to go home and rest, and to let her know if I needed any accommodations at work while I dealt with this. But more than that, she said something that gave me hope. She said I was one of the most talented people on her team, and she wasn't going to let a divorce derail my career. She said when I was ready, there was a promotion waiting for me, and she was going to make sure I got it. I cried in her office for 20 minutes. Not sad tears, but grateful tears. Someone believed in me. Someone saw my worth when I could barely see it myself. That conversation with Linda was a turning point. I realized I'd been so focused on what Marcus had taken from me that I'd forgotten about what I still had. I had my skills, my intelligence, my work ethic. I had people who believed in me. I had the ability to rebuild, but it wasn't a straight path to recovery. There were still so many dark days ahead. Months went by. Winter came and my studio apartment was drafty and cold. I couldn't afford to keep the heat above 65 degrees. I wore layers of clothing inside and tried not to think about the heated floors Marcus and I had installed in our master bathroom just 2 years earlier. The holidays were the worst. Thanksgiving, Christmas, New Year's Eve. Days that used to be filled with family gatherings and celebration became just reminders of everything I'd lost. My parents invited me to spend Thanksgiving with them, but I couldn't face the pity in their eyes, the careful way they avoided mentioning Marcus, the way they'd look at me like I was broken. So I spent Thanksgiving alone in my studio apartment, eating a sandwich and watching old movies, pretending I was fine. Diana called me 3 times that day, but I didn't answer. I couldn't pretend to be grateful when all I felt was empty. Christmas was worse. I'd always loved Christmas. Marcus and I used to go all out with decorations, hosting parties, buying elaborate gifts for everyone. This year, I couldn't afford a tree. I couldn't afford presents for anyone. I sent cards to my closest friends and family with generic holiday wishes, and I spent Christmas Day working on a project for a client because it was better than sitting alone in my apartment thinking about how different my life had become. My credit cards were maxed out. I was living on ramen noodles and whatever free food I could get at work events. I stopped going out with friends because I couldn't afford to split the bill at restaurants. I made excuses about being busy, about needing to work late, about not feeling well. But the truth was, I was ashamed. Ashamed of how far I'd fallen. Ashamed that I couldn't afford the life I used to have. Diana saw through my excuses. She showed up at my apartment one Saturday in December with bags of groceries and a determination to force me to take care of myself. She walked in, looked around at the mess I'd been living in, the dishes piled in the sink, the laundry overflowing from a basket in the corner, and she just started cleaning. She didn't say anything judgmental, didn't lecture me about letting things get this bad. She just rolled up her sleeves and helped. While we cleaned, she talked to me about what she'd been seeing. She said I was disappearing, that I wasn't returning calls, that I was isolating myself. She said she understood that I was going through hell, but she couldn't watch me give up. I told her I wasn't giving up. I was just trying to survive. Diana stopped what she was doing and looked at me directly. She said that's exactly what giving up looks like. It looks like just surviving, just getting through each day without actually living. She said I deserved more than that, and she wasn't going to let me forget it. We talked for hours that day. Really talked, in a way we hadn't since this whole nightmare began. I told her about the panic attacks, about the constant anxiety about money, about how I felt like I was drowning and nobody could see it. I told her about waking up every morning and having a moment of forgetting what had happened, and then remembering, and feeling like I was being crushed all over again. She listened to everything, and then she said something that I needed to hear. She said what Marcus did wasn't about me. It wasn't because I wasn't good enough or pretty enough or successful enough. It was about him and his own failures as a human being. She said I needed to stop trying to figure out what I could have done differently and start focusing on what I was going to do next. That conversation planted a seed. It didn't fix everything overnight, but it started something. It made me realize I had a choice. I could let this experience destroy me, or I could use it to become stronger. The lowest point came in January. I was working late at the office, trying to finish a presentation for a client meeting the next morning. Everyone else had gone home hours ago. My phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. I answered cautiously, saying hello. A woman's voice asked if this was Jennifer. I said yes and asked who was calling. She laughed, but it wasn't a friendly sound. She said she was calling because she thought I should know that Marcus and she were engaged. They were getting married in June, as soon as the divorce was finalized. He wanted her to have my ring resized for her, and she thought I should know he'd moved on. I hung up without saying a word. My hands were shaking so badly I knocked over my coffee, and it spilled across my keyboard, ruining it. I didn't even care. I just sat there, staring at the brown liquid dripping onto the floor, and wondered how I'd gotten to this point in my life. That call was a violation. She'd called me to hurt me, to rub in my face that Marcus had replaced me so easily. And it worked. It hurt in a way that I didn't think was possible anymore. I thought I'd hit rock bottom when Marcus left, but apparently, there were still lower places to fall. I sat in that empty office for 2 more hours, staring at my ruined keyboard, replaying that conversation in my head. Marcus had given her my ring, the ring he'd proposed with on that beach in Mexico, telling me I was the love of his life. He'd taken it back, had it resized, and was giving it to someone else like our entire marriage had meant nothing. When I finally left the office that night, it was past 11. The building was locked up tight, and I had to have security let me out. The guard, an older man named Michael who I'd seen dozens of times but never really talked to, looked at me with concern. Michael asked if I was okay. I nodded automatically, saying I was fine, just working late. He didn't look convinced. He said he'd been working security for 20 years, and he knew what someone who wasn't okay looked like. He said whatever I was going through, it would get better. It always did. I thanked him and walked to my car, which was one of only 3 vehicles left in the parking garage. I sat in the driver's seat for a long time before I could bring myself to start the engine. Michael's words kept echoing in my head. It would get better. Would it, though? How could it possibly get better when every day seemed to bring a new humiliation, a new reminder of everything I'd lost? That night, I seriously considered giving up, not in any permanent way, but just walking away from the whole mess. Marcus could have it all. I'd move to another city, start completely over, change my name, disappear from this life that had become unbearable. What was the point of fighting for scraps when he'd already taken everything that mattered? I was lying on my blow-up mattress, staring at the ceiling of my depressing studio apartment, when my phone buzzed. It was a text from a number I didn't have saved, but I recognized the area code as the same as Marcus's family's business. The message said it was Robert and that he needed to speak with me. It was important. He asked if he could come by tomorrow evening around 7. Robert, my ex-father-in-law, the man who'd welcomed me into the family 13 years ago, who'd given that toast at our wedding. I hadn't heard from him since the day Marcus left. I'd assumed he was on his son's side. Why wouldn't he be? I stared at the message for a long time before responding. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to tell him that his family had done enough damage, but curiosity got the better of me. I typed back saying okay, but I should warn him my apartment wasn't much. I'd text him the address. He responded immediately saying that was fine and he'd see me tomorrow. I spent the next day anxious and distracted. What could Robert possibly want? Was he going to try to convince me to drop the divorce proceedings? To accept some insulting settlement? To remind me that I'd never been good enough for his son? By 7 o'clock the next evening, I'd worked myself into a state. I'd cleaned the apartment as best I could, which wasn't saying much since I barely had any furniture. I'd put on decent clothes instead of the sweatpants I'd been living in. I'd even attempted to make myself look presentable, though the mirror told me I'd aged 5 years in the past 6 months. When the knock came at my door, my heart jumped into my throat. I opened it to find Robert standing there, and I was shocked by how much he'd aged too. He'd always been this larger-than-life figure, confident and commanding. But the man standing in my doorway looked tired and smaller somehow. Robert thanked me for seeing him. I stepped aside to let him in. He looked around the apartment, taking in the blow-up mattress, the folding chair, the plastic crates I was using as furniture. His jaw tightened. Robert spoke quietly, saying he didn't realize it was this bad. I crossed my arms defensively and asked what he thought. Did he think Marcus left me set up in luxury? His son took everything, Robert. Everything. He nodded slowly, saying he knew. That's why he was here. He pulled an envelope out of his jacket pocket and held it out to me. I didn't take it immediately, just stared at it suspiciously. Robert told me to open it. I took the envelope with shaking hands and pulled out the contents. There were papers inside, legal documents that I couldn't quite process at first. And there was a check. A check made out to me for $75,000. I looked up at Robert in confusion, saying I didn't understand. He gestured to the folding chair and asked if he could sit. I nodded, still too stunned to speak. He sat down heavily, and I remained standing, clutching the envelope. Robert began, saying he needed to tell me something about his son, something he should have told me years ago, but he was too much of a coward, and he wanted to believe Marcus had changed. He took a deep breath and said Marcus had done this before. Not the marriage part, but the taking everything part. He'd been stealing from the family business for 6 years. Small amounts at first, then larger and larger sums. Robert discovered it 2 years ago and confronted him about it. Marcus promised to stop, promised to pay it back. Robert believed him because he wanted to believe him. He was his son. I finally found my voice and asked what this had to do with me. Robert's face was pained. He said everything. Marcus knew Robert had discovered his theft. He knew Robert was getting close to having proof he couldn't ignore. So Marcus decided to secure assets wherever he could before Robert could cut him off from the business. My savings account, the equity in the house, everything. He liquidated what he could and hid it. The room seemed to tilt. I asked if he was saying Marcus married me for money. Robert said no quickly. He didn't think it started that way. He thought Marcus loved me, in his own broken way. But when things got desperate, when his theft was about to be exposed, he saw an opportunity. Robert said he wasn't defending him. What Marcus did was unforgivable. Robert continued, explaining more details I hadn't known. He said that 2 years ago, when he first discovered the discrepancies in the company books, he'd hired a forensic accountant to investigate. The accountant had traced Marcus's theft back 6 years, to shortly before we'd bought our house. Robert said he now believed Marcus had used stolen money from the company for our down payment, which was why he'd insisted on putting the house in his name only. It wasn't about tax purposes at all. It was about hiding stolen assets. I felt sick. Everything about our marriage had been built on lies. The house I'd loved so much, the life I'd thought we were building together, it was all funded by theft and deception. Robert pulled out more documents from the envelope and spread them on the folding chair between us. He walked me through each one, explaining what they proved. The first set of documents showed wire transfers from the company accounts to various personal accounts in Marcus's name, accounts I'd never known existed. The amounts ranged from $5,000 to $20,000 at a time, carefully spaced out to avoid detection. Over 6 years, it added up to nearly $300,000. The second set showed how Marcus had closed our joint savings account and moved the money into one of these hidden accounts within hours of leaving. He'd planned the timing perfectly, doing it on a day when he knew I'd be at work late for that client meeting. The third set was bank statements showing that Marcus had taken out a second mortgage on our house without my knowledge 6 months before he left. He'd forged my signature on the documents. Robert had only discovered this recently when the mortgage company contacted him as a reference for Marcus's business. I stared at these documents, my hands trembling. The man I'd married, the man I'd trusted with everything, had been systematically stealing and deceiving for years, and I'd been so blind, so trusting, that I'd never suspected a thing. Robert said quietly that he'd gone to the police 3 days ago. Marcus was going to be charged with embezzlement, fraud, and forgery. The case was being built, and it was solid. Marcus would likely face prison time. I asked why Robert was telling me all this now, why he'd waited so long. Robert's eyes filled with tears, and I'd never seen him cry before. He said he'd been protecting Marcus his whole life, making excuses for him, cleaning up his messes. He'd convinced himself that if he just gave Marcus one more chance, he'd change. But watching what Marcus had done to me, watching how he'd destroyed my life without remorse, had finally opened Robert's eyes. He said he couldn't protect Marcus anymore. Not from this. And he couldn't let Marcus do the same thing to another innocent woman. That's why he was giving me these documents, why he was testifying against his own son in the criminal case. Robert said the woman Marcus was engaged to came from old money. Her family had a trust fund worth millions. Marcus had already started positioning himself to access that money, to do to her exactly what he'd done to me. But Robert had reached out to her father and warned him. The engagement was already falling apart. I asked what happened when her father found out. Robert said the father had hired a private investigator who'd uncovered everything. The theft from the business, the forged documents, the pattern of financial manipulation. Marcus's fiancée had broken off the engagement 2 days ago when her father showed her the evidence. So that's why Marcus had been unreachable, I thought. His whole house of cards was collapsing. The room seemed to tilt. I asked if he was saying Marcus married me for money. Robert said no quickly. He didn't think it started that way. He thought Marcus loved me in his own broken way. But when things got desperate, when his theft was about to be exposed, he saw an opportunity. Robert said he wasn't defending him. What Marcus did was unforgivable. I sank down onto the edge of the blow-up mattress and asked why he was telling me this. Why now? Robert leaned forward, his hands clasped together. He said because he just found out about the woman, the one Marcus was planning to marry. She had money, family money. And when Robert looked into it, he realized Marcus was doing the same thing to her that he did to me. He was positioning himself to take everything. I said bitterly, "So you're here to save her, not me." Robert said firmly that he was here to save both of us, and to try to make right what his son did wrong. That check was from his personal account, not the business. It was what he calculated I contributed to the savings account based on my salary history. It wasn't everything I was owed, but it was a start. I looked at the check again. $75,000. It wasn't the $150,000 from our savings, but it was enough to change my immediate situation, enough to get a decent apartment, to pay off my credit cards, to stop drowning. I asked slowly about the legal documents. Robert reached over and pointed to specific pages. He said these were affidavits documenting Marcus's theft from the family business, with dates and amounts. This was a statement from their accountant confirming the timeline. And this was a letter from him stating that he provided money for the house down payment as a gift to both of us, not just to Marcus. I stared at him and said this could be used in the divorce proceedings. Robert said that's exactly what it was for. Patricia, my lawyer, was a friend of a friend. He'd already sent copies to her. With this documentation, she believed she could get me at least half of what I was owed, probably more. I didn't know what to say. Part of me was angry that he'd waited so long, that he'd let his son destroy my life before stepping in. But another part of me was just grateful that someone in that family had a conscience. Robert stood up to leave. He said he was sorry. Sorry he didn't see what Marcus was becoming. Sorry he didn't protect me. Sorry he let the business, the family reputation, matter more than doing the right thing. He walked to the door, then turned back. He said for what it was worth, he always liked me. I was good for Marcus. Or at least I could have been if he'd let me. He hoped this helped. After he left, I sat on that blow-up mattress for hours, holding the check and the documents. Diana called, but I didn't answer. I needed time to process what had just happened. The next morning, I deposited the check. I called Patricia and confirmed that Robert had sent her the documents. She was practically giddy on the phone. Patricia said this changed everything. With this evidence of fraud and financial misconduct, we could make a case that Marcus systematically stripped marital assets with the intent to defraud me. We could go after the full amount of the savings, a portion of the house's equity, and possibly even damages. For the first time in months, I felt something other than despair. I felt angry. Really, properly angry. Not sad, not defeated, but furious at what had been done to me and determined to fight back. The divorce proceedings shifted dramatically. Marcus's expensive lawyer suddenly seemed less confident. With Robert's evidence in play, the narrative changed from me being a dependent spouse, contributing nothing to me being the victim of calculated financial abuse. Marcus finally broke his silence and sent me a long email trying to explain himself. It was full of justifications and excuses, but the core of it was that he'd felt trapped, that the pressure from his father and the business had been too much, that he'd made mistakes. Not once did he actually apologize for what he'd done to me. I wrote back exactly one sentence saying I hoped she was worth it. The divorce was finalized in late March. The final settlement gave me $78,000 from Marcus, which when combined with Robert's check, gave me just over $150,000 total. It wasn't everything I'd lost, but it was substantial. I also got one of the cars, the one I'd actually driven, which Marcus had been hiding in a storage unit. The house was being sold, and I'd get 20% of the proceeds after the mortgage was paid off. But more than the money, I got something else. I got myself back. Moving out of that studio apartment was one of the most satisfying experiences of my life. I found a nice one-bedroom place in a neighborhood I loved, with big windows and actual heat. I bought real furniture, not expensive stuff, but things that were mine and that I'd chosen. I got a promotion at work, the one my boss had been hinting at. It came with a significant raise and the opportunity to lead my own team. For the first time in years, I felt valued and competent. The promotion came with its own challenges, though. Leading a team meant I had to project confidence and stability even on days when I was barely holding it together. It meant making tough decisions, managing conflicts, and being responsible for other people's work and careers. My team consisted of 5 people, ranging from fresh graduates to seasoned professionals. One of them, a woman named Rachel who was about my age, seemed skeptical of my leadership from the start. She'd been with the company longer than I had and had clearly expected to get the promotion herself. In our first team meeting, Rachel challenged almost every decision I made. She questioned my strategic direction, my timeline, my approach to client management. It felt like she was testing me, trying to find my weak points. The old Jennifer, the one who'd existed before Marcus destroyed my life, might have crumbled under that scrutiny. She might have second-guessed herself, tried to appease Rachel, backed down from her decisions to avoid conflict. But the new Jennifer, the one who'd survived losing everything and rebuilt herself from scratch, didn't back down. I listened to Rachel's concerns, acknowledged where she had valid points, but firmly maintained my position on the strategic direction I'd chosen. I made it clear that while I valued her input, I was the one making the final decisions as team lead. After the meeting, Linda called me into her office. I thought maybe I'd been too harsh, too inflexible, but instead, she smiled. Linda said she'd been watching how I handled Rachel, and she was impressed. She said leadership wasn't about being liked by everyone. It was about making the right decisions and standing behind them, even when people pushed back. She told me something else, too. She said Rachel had responded the exact same way when Linda had been promoted to her position 10 years ago. It wasn't personal. It was Rachel's way of testing whether a new leader was strong enough to handle pressure. That made me feel better, but it also made me realize something. I was strong enough. I had been tested by something far worse than a skeptical colleague, and I'd survived. Work challenges felt manageable compared to what I'd been through. Over the next few months, my team started to come together. Rachel gradually warmed up to my leadership style, especially after we landed a major account that I'd personally pitched. The younger team members looked up to me, often coming to me for advice not just about work, but about their careers and lives. One of them, a recent graduate named Melissa, came to my office one day looking nervous. She asked if she could talk to me about something personal. Melissa told me she'd been offered a job at another company with better pay. She wanted to take it, but she was afraid of disappointing me, afraid of seeming disloyal after I'd invested time in training her. I thought about my own career, about all the opportunities I'd turned down because Marcus's needs had always come first, about how I'd stayed in positions longer than I should have because I didn't want to rock the boat at home. I told Melissa to take the job. I said loyalty to a company was fine, but loyalty to herself and her own growth was more important. I said I'd write her a glowing recommendation and I'd be genuinely happy for her success, even if it meant I'd have to hire and train someone new. She left my office in tears, thanking me. A few weeks later, she sent me a card saying that conversation had changed how she thought about her career and her life. She said I'd shown her that it was possible to be professional and ambitious while also being kind and supportive. That card is still on my desk. It reminds me that surviving what Marcus did to me made me a better leader, a better mentor, a better person. The pain I went through wasn't wasted. It taught me things I couldn't have learned any other way. The raise for my promotion allowed me to move out of that depressing studio apartment sooner than I'd expected. I found a nice one-bedroom place in a neighborhood I loved, with big windows and actual heat. I bought real furniture, not expensive stuff, but things that were mine and that I'd chosen. I remember the day I moved into that apartment. Diana and Kevin helped me, along with Thomas and a few other friends. We made a day of it, ordering pizza, laughing, arranging furniture. At one point, I stood in the middle of my new living room, surrounded by people who genuinely cared about me, and I felt something I hadn't felt in over a year. I felt happy. Not the giddy, temporary happiness of a good day, but a deep, sustainable contentment with where my life was heading. Diana noticed me standing there with a strange expression on my face. She asked if I was okay. I told her I was more than okay. I was actually happy. For real. She hugged me tight and said she'd been waiting to see that look on my face again. She said she'd known I'd get here eventually, even when I didn't believe it myself. Financial independence became incredibly important to me. I opened new accounts in my name only, started building an emergency fund, invested in a retirement account. I tracked every penny I spent, not out of deprivation, but out of a desire to be in complete control of my financial life. I met with a financial advisor, a recommendation from Patricia, my divorce lawyer. The advisor helped me create a plan for the settlement money I'd received. Part of it went into safe investments, part into my emergency fund, part into paying off my credit card debt from the worst months of the divorce. For the first time in my adult life, I understood my own finances completely. I knew exactly how much money I had, where it was, and what it was doing. I knew I could support myself, that I didn't need anyone else to survive. That knowledge was powerful. Diana and I celebrated my finalized divorce with a girls' weekend in Miami. We drank too much, danced until our feet hurt, and laughed until we cried. She kept saying how proud she was of me, how strong I'd been, and I realized that somewhere along the way, I'd actually become strong. Not just pretending, but genuinely capable of standing on my own. I started therapy. I'd been resistant to it during the divorce, thinking I could handle everything myself, but Diana finally convinced me to try it. My therapist, Dr. Chen, was patient and insightful. She helped me understand that what Marcus had done wasn't about me not being enough. It was about his own brokenness, his own inability to be honest and vulnerable. Dr. Chen said in one of our sessions that I kept trying to figure out what I could have done differently to prevent this. But the truth was, I couldn't have prevented someone else's choice to deceive me. That wasn't about my worth. That was about his character. Those words freed something in me. I'd been carrying this weight of failure, this sense that if I'd just been better somehow, Marcus wouldn't have left. But he'd made his choices long before he'd cleaned out our house. The woman he was engaged to? I found out from mutual acquaintances that he'd been seeing her for almost 2 years. Our marriage had been over in his mind long before I'd known there was a problem. Therapy became my lifeline over the following months. I went every Thursday evening, and those sessions became a space where I could be completely honest about how I was feeling without worrying about being a burden or seeming weak. In one session, about 6 weeks into therapy, Dr. Chen asked me to describe who I was before I met Marcus. What had I wanted from life? What had my dreams been? I sat there for a long time, trying to remember. The girl I'd been at 23 seemed like a stranger to me now. I'd wanted to travel, I remembered. I'd wanted to take my marketing skills and maybe work for an international company, spend time living in different countries. I'd wanted to write, maybe work on a novel someday. I'd wanted to be independent and adventurous. Dr. Chen asked what happened to those dreams. I said they'd gotten lost somewhere along the way. Marcus had never explicitly told me not to pursue them, but there was always a reason to wait. Wait until we were more financially stable. Wait until his business was more established. Wait until we had kids. And then eventually, I'd stopped even thinking about them. Dr. Chen said something that stuck with me. She said that Marcus taking everything from me had actually given me something. It had given me the opportunity to figure out who I was without him, to rediscover those dreams I'd buried, to build a life that was authentically mine. I wasn't sure I believed her at first. It felt like trying to find a silver lining in something that was pure darkness. But she encouraged me to start small. She asked me to do one thing each week that was just for me, something that connected to who I'd been before Marcus, or who I wanted to become. The first week, I went to a bookstore and spent 2 hours browsing. I bought 3 novels I'd been wanting to read, even though my budget was tight. I told myself it was an investment in my healing. The second week, I looked up community education classes and signed up for a beginner's Spanish class. I'd always wanted to learn Spanish, had even minored in it in college, but I'd let it lapse over the years. The third week, I started writing again. Nothing fancy, just journaling at first. But then I started writing short pieces about my experience, about what I was learning about myself. It felt good to put words to what I was going through. Dr. Chen also worked with me on my anxiety and panic attacks. She taught me breathing techniques, grounding exercises, ways to interrupt the spiral of negative thoughts before they overwhelmed me. She helped me understand that trauma responses were normal, that what I was experiencing was my body's way of trying to protect me from future hurt. One of the most powerful sessions came about 3 months into therapy. Dr. Chen asked me to write a letter to Marcus, not to send, but just to express everything I needed to say. I spent a whole week on that letter, writing and rewriting, pouring out all my anger, my hurt, my confusion, my grief. When I read it aloud in our session, I cried harder than I had in months. But when I finished, I felt lighter, like I'd been carrying all those words around inside me, and finally releasing them had freed up space for something else. Dr. Chen asked me what I wanted to fill that space with. I thought about it and said hope. I wanted to fill it with hope that my life could be good again, that I could trust again, that I could build something beautiful from these ashes. She smiled and said that was a good start. I ran into Robert one more time, at a coffee shop downtown. He was ordering when I walked in, and our eyes met. There was an awkward moment where neither of us knew what to say. Finally, I walked over and said his name. He nodded and asked how I was. I said I was good, and I meant it. Really good, actually. I thanked him for what he did, for the check and the documents. It made a difference. He looked relieved and said he was glad. He heard about the settlement. Marcus wasn't happy, but he brought it on himself. There was a pause, and then Robert said quietly that Marcus had called off the engagement. The woman's family found out about his theft from the business. Apparently, her father did a background check. I should have felt vindicated, but I mostly just felt sad. Sad for Marcus, who'd destroyed his life for money he couldn't even keep. Sad for the woman who'd almost made the same mistake I did. Sad for Robert, who'd lost his son to greed and dishonesty. I said I was sorry. Robert smiled sadly and said he was too. But some people have to hit rock bottom before they can start climbing back up. Maybe this would be Marcus's. We parted on good terms, and I realized that I'd forgiven Robert for his part in everything. He tried to make it right when he could have just protected his son. That took courage. The months after the divorce were about rebuilding. Not just rebuilding my life, but rebuilding myself. I'd lost myself in that marriage, trying so hard to be what Marcus needed that I'd forgotten to be what I needed. I started doing things I'd given up over the years. I took a painting class at the community center, something I'd always wanted to try, but Marcus had dismissed as a waste of time. The instructor, an older woman named Margaret with paint-stained hands and kind eyes, encouraged us to paint our feelings rather than trying to create something technically perfect. My first painting was a mess of dark colors, angry slashes of black and deep purple. Margaret looked at it and said it was honest. She said that's what art should be, a reflection of truth, not just pretty pictures to hang on walls. Over the weeks, my paintings started to change. The colors got brighter, the brushstrokes became less aggressive. By the end of the 8-week course, I'd painted a sunrise, all oranges and pinks and golds, and when I stepped back to look at it, I realized it represented hope. my hope that life could be beautiful again. Margaret pulled me aside after the last class and told me I had real talent. She said she taught advanced classes on Saturday mornings if I was interested. I signed up immediately, and painting became my therapy in a different way than Dr. Chen's office. It was a way to express things I didn't have words for. I also joined a hiking group that met every Sunday morning. At first, I was the slowest one, huffing and puffing up trails that other people seemed to glide up effortlessly. But I kept showing up, kept pushing myself, and gradually I got stronger. There was something meditative about hiking. One foot in front of the other, focused on the path ahead, surrounded by trees and sky and the sound of birds. On those trails, I didn't think about Marcus or the divorce or what I'd lost. I just existed in the moment, breathing clean air, feeling my muscles work, being alive. The hiking group was a mix of people from all walks of life. There was Janet, a retired teacher who'd been hiking these trails for 30 years. There was Miguel, a software engineer who used hiking to decompress from his stressful job. There was a young couple, Emma and David, who were training for a mountain climbing trip to Colorado. Nobody knew about my divorce at first. I was just Jennifer, the new person who was learning to love hiking, and that anonymity was liberating. I could be whoever I wanted to be with these people, not defined by my failed marriage or my losses. But eventually, on a particularly challenging hike about 3 months after I'd joined the group, I opened up to Janet. We'd fallen behind the others, both of us needing to take breaks more frequently, and she asked me what had brought me to the group. I told her the truth, that I'd been through a devastating divorce, that I was trying to find myself again, that hiking made me feel strong in a way I hadn't felt in years. Janet listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she told me her story. She'd lost her husband to cancer 5 years earlier. They'd been married for 42 years. She said the grief had nearly destroyed her, that she'd spent the first year after his death barely functioning. Janet said hiking had saved her life. It gave her a reason to get out of bed, to leave the empty house, to keep moving forward even when she wanted to give up. She said the mountains had taught her that you can climb something that seems impossible if you just take it one step at a time. That conversation bonded us. Janet became a mentor of sorts, someone who understood loss and rebuilding in a way most people didn't. She invited me to her house for tea one afternoon, and I was struck by how beautiful her life was even in the absence of her husband. She had her garden, her books, her hiking, her volunteer work at the local library. She'd built a life that honored her past while still moving forward. I asked her how she did it, how she kept going after losing someone she'd loved for so long. Janet said something I'll never forget. She said she had a choice every single day. She could stay in bed, mourning what she'd lost, or she could get up and find reasons to be grateful for what she still had. She said some days the choice was easier than others, but she kept making it, over and over, until eventually the good days outnumbered the bad ones. I also started reading again, really reading. Not just scrolling through articles on my phone, but actually sitting down with physical books and losing myself in other people's stories. I joined a book club that met at a local coffee shop once a month. The book club was mostly women, ranging from their 20s to their 70s. We read everything from literary fiction to memoirs to mysteries. But the discussions were about more than just the books. They were about our lives, our experiences, the connections we saw between the stories we read and the stories we lived. One month, we read a memoir by a woman who'd rebuilt her life after her husband emptied their bank accounts and disappeared. The parallels to my own story were striking, and during the discussion, I found myself sharing my experience for the first time with people outside my immediate circle. The response was overwhelming. Half the women in that book club had similar stories, divorces that had left them financially devastated, betrayals by people they'd trusted, losses that had seemed insurmountable at the time. And yet here they all were, living full lives, laughing, reading, supporting each other. One woman, whose name was Carol, told me after the meeting that hearing my story had helped her. She was in the middle of her own divorce, facing many of the same challenges I'd faced, and she'd felt so alone. Knowing that someone else had been through it and come out the other side gave her hope. That's when I realized something important. My pain had a purpose. By sharing my story, by being honest about what I'd been through, I could help other people feel less alone in their own struggles. That gave meaning to everything I'd suffered. I reconnected with old friends I'd drifted away from during my marriage. Some of them admitted they'd never liked Marcus but hadn't wanted to say anything. That stung a little, but I understood. Would I have listened if they'd told me? Probably not. One of those friends was Alexis, my college roommate. We'd been inseparable in school, but after I married Marcus, we'd slowly lost touch. She'd moved to Seattle for a job, and between the distance and my absorption in my marriage, we'd gone from talking every day to exchanging birthday texts once a year. When I reached out to her after the divorce, she flew across the country to spend a weekend with me. We stayed up until 3 in the morning that first night, catching up on 10 years of life. She told me about her career in tech, her own relationship struggles, the life she'd built on the West Coast. And she told me something that was hard to hear, but that I needed to know. She said she'd tried to stay close to me after I married Marcus, but he'd made it difficult. He'd always had an excuse for why I couldn't visit her, why she couldn't visit us, why we couldn't talk on the phone. He'd been subtly but systematically isolating me from my friends, and she'd watched it happen without knowing how to stop it. Alexis said she'd tried to bring it up once, early in my marriage, and I'd gotten defensive, so she'd backed off, hoping I'd reach out when I was ready, but I never did. She said she'd felt guilty for years, wondering if there was something more she could have done. I told her it wasn't her fault. Marcus had been manipulative in ways I was only now beginning to understand. He'd made me believe that my friends didn't really care about me, that they were jealous of my marriage, that I was better off focusing on him and his family. And I'd believed him because I'd wanted to believe that he had my best interests at heart. Alexis and I made a pact that weekend. No matter where we were or what was happening in our lives, we'd talk at least once a week. And we've kept that pact. Those weekly calls with her became an anchor, a reminder that I had people in my life who'd known me before Marcus, who remembered who I really was. Diana's husband, Kevin, introduced me to a colleague of his about 8 months after my divorce was finalized. His name was Thomas, and he was quiet and thoughtful in a way Marcus had never been. We went out for coffee, and he spent most of the conversation asking about my interests, my work, my life. He didn't try to impress me. He just seemed genuinely interested in knowing me. I told him on that first date that I needed him to know that I was divorced, and it was really bad. I wasn't looking for anything serious. Thomas said that was fair. He wasn't trying to be serious. He just thought I seemed interesting, and he wanted to get to know me. No pressure. We started seeing each other casually. He never pushed for more than I was ready to give. He was patient when I had moments of panic, when old trust issues would surface. He listened when I needed to talk about what I'd been through, but he never made it the focus of our relationship. Our second date was a walk in a park near the city. It was early spring and everything was starting to bloom. We talked about books we'd read, places we wanted to travel, what we'd wanted to be when we were kids. It was easy and comfortable in a way that felt almost foreign to me after years of walking on eggshells around Marcus. Thomas told me he'd been engaged once 5 years ago. His fiancée had called it off 6 months before the wedding, because she'd realized she was in love with someone else. He said it had devastated him at the time, but looking back, he was grateful she'd been honest instead of marrying him when her heart wasn't in it. I appreciated his honesty. It made me feel less alone in my own heartbreak, less like I was damaged goods because of my failed marriage. On our third date, Thomas cooked dinner for me at his apartment. Nothing fancy, just pasta and salad, but he'd clearly put thought into it. He'd remembered that I'd mentioned loving Italian food on our first date. These small acts of attention, of actually listening and remembering, meant more to me than any grand gesture could have. After dinner, we were sitting on his couch talking, and he said something that made me pause. Thomas said he wanted me to know that he understood I was still healing, and he didn't expect anything from me. He was happy just spending time with me, getting to know me, and whatever this turned into or didn't turn into was okay with him. I looked at him, at this kind man who was giving me space to heal, while also showing me what healthy affection looked like, and I felt something shift inside me. It scared me how much I was starting to care about him. I told him I needed to be honest about something. I said I was terrified. Terrified of trusting someone again, terrified of being vulnerable, terrified that I'd let someone in and they'd destroy me the way Marcus had. Thomas reached over and took my hand gently. He said he couldn't promise that I'd never get hurt again because that's not how life works. But he could promise that he'd never deliberately hurt me, never lie to me, never make me question my worth. He said if I ever felt like he was doing any of those things, I should tell him, and he'd listen. That conversation was the beginning of something real between us. I stopped thinking of our relationship as casual and started allowing myself to imagine a future where I could be happy with someone again. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. About 4 months into dating him, I had a moment of panic that almost ended everything. Thomas had asked if he could leave some clothes at my apartment since he was staying over a few nights a week. It was a reasonable request, a normal step in a relationship. But when he said it, I felt my chest tighten and my breathing become shallow. All I could think about was Marcus moving his stuff out, taking everything, leaving me with nothing. The idea of someone else having their belongings in my space triggered something primal in me. I told Thomas I needed some time to think about it, and he said, of course, no problem. But after he left that night, I had a full panic attack. I called Dr. Chen, even though it was past her office hours, and left a desperate voicemail. She called me back within an hour, which I later learned was something she rarely did, but she could hear the distress in my message. Dr. Chen talked me through the panic attack, helping me breathe, helping me ground myself in the present moment instead of the trauma of the past. Then she asked me what I was really afraid of. I said I was afraid of giving someone access to my life again, afraid of trusting someone enough to let them in, only to have them take everything and leave. She asked me if Thomas had done anything to make me believe he would do that. I said no. He'd been nothing but respectful and kind. But Marcus had seemed kind too, at first. Dr. Chen reminded me that not everyone is Marcus. She said I had a choice. I could let my fear of being hurt again prevent me from ever being close to anyone, or I could take small, manageable risks with someone who'd proven themselves trustworthy. She said Thomas leaving clothes at my apartment wasn't giving him power to destroy me. It was just clothes. We talked for almost an hour, and by the end of the call, I felt calmer. Dr. Chen scheduled an emergency session with me for the next morning, and we worked through more of my fears and trauma responses. The next time I saw Thomas, I apologized for my reaction. I explained more about what Marcus had done, about how hard it was for me to trust anyone with access to my life or my space. Thomas listened without judgment. Then he said something that made me love him, though I wasn't ready to say those words yet. He said he understood, and there was no rush. He said we could move at whatever pace felt comfortable for me. If I needed another 6 months before he left clothes at my place, that was fine. If I needed a year, that was fine too. He said he was in this for the long haul and he'd wait for me to be ready. That patience, that willingness to meet me where I was instead of pushing me to be where he wanted me to be, was everything. It showed me what real love looked like. Not the consuming, controlling kind of love Marcus had shown, but the patient, supportive kind that actually wanted me to heal and grow. About 4 months into dating him, I realized something important. I was happy. Not just okay, not just getting by, but genuinely happy. I had a job I loved, friends who supported me, a hobby that brought me joy, and a man in my life who treated me with respect and kindness. One evening, Thomas and I were cooking dinner together in my apartment. He was chopping vegetables while I stirred sauce, and we were debating about whether a certain movie deserved its critical acclaim. It was such a normal, domestic moment, but it struck me how different it felt from my marriage. I stopped stirring and looked at him, saying his name. He looked up and asked what. I said thank you. He set down the knife, looking confused, and asked for what. I tried to find the right words. I said for being patient with me, for not trying to fix me or change me, for just letting me be. He walked over and kissed my forehead gently, saying I didn't need fixing. I needed time and space to heal. That was different. That's when I knew I was falling in love with him. Not the desperate, grasping kind of love I'd had with Marcus, where I'd been so afraid of losing him that I'd lost myself. This was a calm, steady kind of love, built on mutual respect and genuine affection. A year after my divorce was finalized, I went back to the old neighborhood where Marcus and I had lived. The house had been sold months earlier, but I hadn't been back since. I parked across the street and just looked at it. A young family lived there now. I could see toys in the yard and a minivan in the driveway. Through the window, I glimpsed a woman setting the table for dinner. It was strange to see someone else living the life I'd thought would be mine. But I didn't feel sad. I felt grateful. Grateful that this chapter of my life was over. Grateful that I'd survived it. Grateful that I'd come out stronger on the other side. Diana texted me as I was sitting there asking where I was. Thomas said I had something I wanted to tell them tonight. I smiled and started the car. I'd planned a dinner for my closest friends because I had news. I'd been promoted again at work, this time to creative director. It was the job I'd been working toward my entire career, and I'd earned it on my own merits, not because of who I was married to. At dinner that night, surrounded by the people who'd stood by me through everything, I made a toast. I said a little over a year ago, I lost everything, or at least I thought I did. I lost my house, my savings, my marriage. I lost my sense of security and my trust in people. But here's what I didn't lose. I didn't lose myself, not permanently anyway, and I didn't lose the ability to rebuild. I looked around the table at Diana and Kevin, at Thomas, at my other friends who'd shown up when I needed them. I said I learned that having nothing material isn't the same as having nothing. I had friends who loved me. I had skills and determination. I had the ability to start over. And most importantly, I learned that I'm stronger than I ever thought I was. Diana raised her glass, tears in her eyes, saying to Jennifer, who survived and thrived. Everyone clinked glasses and echoed the sentiment. As I sat there, laughing and talking with the people I loved, I realized something profound. Marcus leaving had been the worst thing that ever happened to me, but it had also been a gift in disguise. It had forced me to confront who I really was, what I really wanted, and what I was truly capable of. Would I have chosen this path if I'd known what it would cost? Probably not. But now that I was on the other side of it, I wouldn't change it. Every hard lesson, every lonely night, every moment of doubt had shaped me into someone I actually liked. Someone who knew her worth and wouldn't settle for less than she deserved. The legal aftermath continued for a while. Marcus was eventually prosecuted for his theft from the family business. Robert testified against him, which I knew must have been devastating for both of them. Marcus served 18 months in a minimum security facility and was ordered to pay restitution. I didn't follow the case closely. It wasn't my story anymore. I'd taken what I needed from that experience and moved on. Thomas and I got engaged 2 years after we started dating. He proposed on a hiking trail, at sunrise, with no fancy dinner or elaborate setup. It was just us, the mountains, and a simple question asking if I would marry him. I said yes, but I also said I needed him to know that I was getting a prenup. It wasn't about not trusting him. It was about protecting myself. He didn't hesitate and said whatever makes me feel safe. We got married in a small ceremony with just close friends and family. There was no expensive venue, no hundreds of guests, no stress about impressing anyone. It was just about us making a commitment to each other, and it was perfect. On our wedding night, Thomas said something that I'll never forget. He said he promised me this. If we ever have problems, we'll face them together. He won't lie to me, he won't hide things from me, and he will never, ever leave me with nothing. I believed him. Not because I was naive, but because I'd learned to trust my instincts again. I'd learned to see red flags. I'd learned the difference between love that lifts you up and love that tears you down. 3 years after Marcus left, I was standing in my own house, one that Thomas and I had bought together with both our names on the deed. It wasn't as big as the house I'd lost, but it was filled with furniture we'd chosen together, art I'd painted, and the sound of laughter. Diana came over for coffee one Saturday morning, like she often did. We sat on my back porch, watching birds at the feeder I'd hung up. She said, I was so angry at Marcus for so long. But looking at you now, seeing how happy you are, I wonder if he did you a favor. I thought about that and said he didn't do me a favor. He did something terrible, and it hurt like hell. But I did myself a favor by refusing to stay broken. There's a difference. Diana nodded thoughtfully and said I was right. I did this. I rebuilt my life. I added with help, squeezing her hand. I couldn't have done it without her. She smiled and said that's what best friends are for. Looking back now, I can see the whole journey clearly. The woman I was when Marcus left was afraid, dependent, and had no idea of her own strength. She thought her worth was tied to her marriage, to her house, to her accumulated possessions. The woman I am now knows that none of those things define me. My worth comes from within, from my character, from my resilience, from my ability to show up for myself and the people I love. Did Marcus take everything? In the physical sense, yes. He took the house, the cars, the savings. But he didn't take the things that mattered. He didn't take my intelligence, my work ethic, my capacity for love and friendship. He didn't take my future. If anything, by stripping away everything I thought defined me, he forced me to discover who I really was underneath all of that. And I turned out to be someone I could be proud of. I still see Robert occasionally. He's retired from the business now, and he seems lighter somehow, like letting go of trying to protect Marcus from the consequences of his actions freed him. We get coffee sometimes, and he tells me stories about his grandkids from his daughter. There's a sadness in him when it comes to Marcus, but also an acceptance that some things can't be fixed by a father's love. As for Marcus, I heard through mutual acquaintances that he's working as a car salesman in a different state. He remarried, divorced again within a year. I feel nothing when I hear about him now. Not anger, not satisfaction, not even curiosity. He's just someone I used to know in a different life. The biggest gift from that whole horrible experience was learning that I could survive anything. Not just survive, but thrive. I learned that rock bottom is a solid foundation to rebuild on. I learned that the people who stick around when you have nothing are the ones worth keeping in your life. I learned to read my own instincts, to trust my gut when something feels off. I learned that perfect-looking lives can hide deep dysfunction, and that sometimes the hardest thing and the right thing are the same thing. Most importantly, I learned that you can lose everything material and still have everything that matters. You can start over at any age. You can rebuild from nothing. You can take the worst thing that ever happened to you and use it as fuel to become the person you were always meant to be. Now, when I hear about someone going through a divorce or a financial crisis or any kind of devastating loss, I tell them this: you will survive this. It doesn't feel like it right now, and I'm not going to minimize your pain by pretending it's easy. But on the other side of this is a version of you that you can't even imagine yet. A stronger version, a clearer version, a version that knows exactly what she's worth and won't settle for less. The knock on my door that evening when Robert showed up changed everything. But I'm the one who decided what to do with that change. I'm the one who took his help and used it to fight back. I'm the one who went to therapy, who rebuilt my career, who opened my heart to love again. Marcus may have started my journey by taking everything, but I'm the hero of this story. I'm the one who fought through the darkness and came out into the light. I'm the one who proved that you can lose it all and still win in the end. And that's exactly what I did.